My friend, have you ever felt like your life was on the right track, only for everything to suddenly fall apart? Have you ever had dreams, plans, and hopes, only to watch them slip through your fingers, leaving you wondering, why is this happening to me? Where is God in all of this? If you've ever felt betrayed, abandoned, or forgotten, then this story is for you. Today, we are diving into one of the most incredible stories of transformation in the Bible. The story of Joseph, a young man with a bright future, only to have his life ripped apart in an instant. A story of betrayal, injustice, and suffering, but also a story of perseverance, redemption, and divine purpose. Joseph's journey wasn't just about pain, it was about God turning that pain into something greater than he could ever imagine. And if you've ever wondered why God allows suffering, why he lets us go through storms that seem unbearable, Joseph's story holds the answer. This isn't just a story of the past, it's a message for you today. Because just like Joseph, you might be going through something you don't understand. But what if God is using your trials to prepare you for something far greater? Stay with me until the end of this video because I promise you, Joseph's story will change the way you see your struggles. And if you believe that God has a purpose even in the hardest moments of life, type "God is in control" in the comments right now. Let's begin. Imagine being a teenager, full of dreams and ambitions, believing deep down that you were destined for something great. That was Joseph. He wasn't just an ordinary young man. God had placed something special inside him. And one night, he had a dream. In this dream, he and his brothers were binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly, Joseph's sheaf stood up tall, while his brothers' sheaves gathered around and bowed down to it. When he told his brothers about it, they were furious. "Do you really think you will reign over us?" they scoffed. Their resentment toward him only grew. But then, Joseph had another dream. This time it was even bigger. He saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down before him. He shared this dream with his father, Jacob, and his brothers. Even his father, who loved him deeply, was taken aback. "What is this dream you had? Will your mother, your brothers, and I actually bow down to you?" Now let's pause here. Imagine how Joseph must have felt. He had received something powerful from God, a glimpse of his future. But instead of being celebrated, he was met with anger, jealousy, and doubt. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've had a vision, a goal, or a calling that others didn't believe in. Maybe you've tried to share your excitement only to be met with skepticism or even hostility. This is where faith comes in. When God plants a dream inside you, it won't always make sense to the people around you. Sometimes those closest to you won't understand what God is doing in your life. And that's exactly what happened to Joseph. But here's the key. Just because others don't see your destiny doesn't mean it isn't real. Joseph had no idea how much suffering he would have to endure before his dreams came true. But one thing was certain. God had a plan. And if you've ever felt like you were meant for more but life keeps throwing obstacles in your way, type "I trust God's plan" in the comments. Because what happens next in Joseph's life is proof that even when things seem to be falling apart, God is still working behind the scenes. Let's continue. Have you ever had your trust broken by someone you loved? Someone you thought would always have your back? Joseph knew that feeling all too well. After sharing his dreams with his family, his brothers' jealousy and hatred for him grew stronger. One day when Joseph went to check on his brothers as they were tending to the flocks, things took a dark turn. His brothers saw him from a distance, and immediately they began plotting his demise. "Here comes that dreamer," they sneered. "Let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, and we'll say a wild animal devoured him." Imagine the shock and pain Joseph must have felt when he heard these words. These weren't just any brothers. These were the people who were supposed to protect him, love him, and encourage him. But instead, they had conspired to destroy him. Can you relate to that? Maybe you've experienced betrayal by someone you trusted deeply, someone you thought would never hurt you. But as we know, God often works in mysterious ways. It was in that moment of betrayal that God began to set Joseph on a path that would lead to his ultimate purpose. Fortunately, his brother Reuben, the eldest, intervened. He convinced the others not to kill Joseph, but to throw him into a dry cistern instead, planning to rescue him later. But just as quickly as Joseph's life had been spared, it took another unexpected turn. As his brothers sat down to eat, a caravan of Ishmaelites came by, and Judah, one of Joseph's brothers, had a new idea. "Why not sell him to these traders instead?" he suggested. And so, for 20 pieces of silver, Joseph was sold into slavery. Imagine the horror Joseph must have felt as he was bound and taken away, leaving behind everything he knew: his family, his home, his dreams. His life was turned upside down in an instant. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was a complete shift in his reality. Have you ever felt like everything you believed in was suddenly ripped away from you? Have you ever felt like your dreams were shattered by the very people you trusted the most? Joseph's story reminds us that betrayal, while painful, doesn't mean our story is over. It might feel like everything is falling apart, but remember, God has a purpose in every season, even in the darkest ones. And I want to ask you, if you've ever been hurt by someone you trusted, type "I forgive" in the comments. Because forgiveness isn't just for them, it's for you. It's a step toward healing and trusting that God is still in control, no matter how messy things may seem. Joseph's journey had just begun, and though it seemed like his dreams were crushed, God was using that betrayal to set up something far greater. Let's dive deeper into what happened next. Joseph's journey didn't end with betrayal. In fact, it was only just beginning. After being sold to the Ishmaelite traders, Joseph was taken to Egypt, a foreign land where everything was strange, and he was completely alone. Can you imagine being in his shoes, separated from his family, from everything familiar, forced to start over with nothing but his faith and his dreams? Joseph was sold to an Egyptian official named Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. He could have been angry, bitter, or full of resentment. He could have let the circumstances define him, but Joseph chose a different path. He worked hard. He trusted God in the midst of his pain. And because of his unwavering faith and diligence, Potiphar saw something in him, a spirit of excellence that set him apart from others. Joseph quickly rose to a place of trust and responsibility within Potiphar's house. Potiphar put him in charge of his entire household, trusting Joseph with everything he owned. It was a remarkable turnaround considering how far Joseph had fallen. From being the favored son of his father to now a slave in a foreign land, Joseph's life had taken a dramatic turn. But in all of this, Joseph remained focused on God. He understood that no matter his circumstances, God was still with him and his purpose had not changed. Have you ever felt like you were in a place where everything seemed wrong? Like you were stuck in a situation that you couldn't escape, wondering if anything good could come out of it? Joseph's story reminds us that even in our lowest moments, God is working behind the scenes. He's still moving us toward our destiny, even if we can't see it yet. And just when things seemed like they might be getting better for Joseph, something unexpected happened. Potiphar's wife took notice of Joseph. She saw him as a handsome young man, and day after day she tried to seduce him. But Joseph, being a man of integrity and devotion to God, refused. He knew that to sin against Potiphar would be a sin against God. He couldn't allow himself to fall into that temptation, no matter how alluring it seemed. But the situation took a dark turn. One day, when no one else was around, Potiphar's wife grabbed Joseph by his cloak and demanded that he sleep with her. Joseph, in his desperation to escape, fled the scene, leaving his cloak behind. Potiphar's wife, furious that her advances had been rejected, used the cloak to falsely accuse Joseph of attempting to assault her. Imagine the shock and confusion Joseph must have felt. He had done the right thing, but now he found himself accused of a crime he did not commit. Potiphar, heartbroken and betrayed, had no choice but to have Joseph thrown into prison. It seemed like Joseph's life had just taken another turn for the worse. But once again, God was still with him, even in the prison. And this would not be the end of Joseph's story. It was just another step toward his greater purpose. I want to ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you did the right thing, and yet everything seemed to go wrong? Type, "I trust" God in the comments if you've ever felt that way. And remember, just like Joseph, even when it seems like things are falling apart, God is working out something greater in your life. Joseph's journey took yet another turn. After being falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, he was thrown into prison. It must have felt like the ultimate betrayal. He had done everything right, trusted in God, and yet now he found himself locked away in a cold, dark cell. But even in the depths of this unimaginable situation, Joseph did not lose his faith. In prison, Joseph could have easily become bitter or angry. He could have blamed God or questioned why he had allowed such injustice to happen. But instead, Joseph chose to continue honoring God. He didn't let his circumstances define his worth or his purpose. In fact, the Bible tells us that even in the prison, God was with him. The Lord showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. As Joseph faithfully carried out his duties in prison, he began to gain the trust of the prison warden, who entrusted him with overseeing all the other prisoners. Joseph's character, his integrity, and his faith in God made him stand out, even in a place as dark and hopeless as a prison. Imagine the weight of being wrongfully imprisoned. Think about how difficult it must have been for Joseph to keep trusting in God when everything around him screamed hopelessness. But even in this dark place, Joseph never gave up on his faith. He continued to hold on to the promises God had made to him. In the midst of his trials, something incredible happened. Joseph encountered two new prisoners, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, who had fallen out of favor with the king. These two men had troubling dreams, and Joseph, with God's help, interpreted their dreams. For the cupbearer, Joseph predicted that he would be restored to his position, and for the baker, he foretold that he would be executed. Joseph asked the cupbearer, as he was being released, to remember him and speak to Pharaoh on his behalf. But once the cupbearer was restored to his position, he forgot all about Joseph. Once again, Joseph found himself waiting. Yet, even in this time of waiting and disappointment, he continued to trust in God. Joseph's time in prison is a powerful reminder that sometimes God uses the darkest moments of our lives to prepare us for what is ahead. In prison, Joseph wasn't just passively enduring. He was actively growing in faith and character. He was being prepared for something bigger, something greater than he could ever imagine. Joseph's faith was tested, but he passed every test. And God was about to do something extraordinary through him. Have you ever felt like you've been waiting in a season of darkness, like you're in a place where it feels like everything has gone wrong and God seems silent? Don't lose heart. Joseph's story reminds us that even in our hardest times, God is working behind the scenes, preparing us for the next chapter of our journey. Trust him, because his plans are always greater than our circumstances. Joseph's unwavering faith in prison is a testament to what happens when we refuse to give up on God, even in the toughest situations. It shows us that our faith is often tested in the most difficult places, but it's in those places that we grow and are shaped into the person God wants us to be. So if you're in a tough season right now, know that God hasn't forgotten you. Your situation doesn't define your future. Just like Joseph, you are being prepared for something greater. Trust in God's timing and keep believing, because your breakthrough could be just around the corner. The moment Joseph's story took a turn toward the incredible came when he was finally called to interpret Pharaoh's dream. After 2 long years of waiting, Joseph was summoned to the palace. Imagine the mix of emotions he must have felt: the anticipation, the hope, and the fear. This was his moment. But it wasn't just a moment of personal redemption. It was a moment that would change the course of history. You see, Pharaoh had experienced 2 troubling dreams that no one could interpret. His wise men and magicians were stumped, but then the cupbearer remembered Joseph. He recalled how Joseph had accurately interpreted his own dream in prison. Joseph was quickly brought before Pharaoh, and when Pharaoh explained the dreams, Joseph boldly declared that the dreams were a warning from God. In Pharaoh's dream, there were 7 healthy fat cows that were swallowed up by 7 thin, sickly cows. Then there were 7 plump ears of grain that were consumed by 7 thin and withered ears. Joseph explained that the dreams meant there would be 7 years of abundance in Egypt, followed by 7 years of severe famine. The warning was clear. Egypt needed to prepare during the years of plenty for the years of scarcity ahead. Joseph didn't just interpret the dreams, he also offered a solution. He advised Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning man to oversee the collection of grain during the years of plenty, so that Egypt would have enough during the years of famine. This was a brilliant strategy, and Pharaoh was so impressed that he immediately appointed Joseph to this high position of authority. In an instant, Joseph went from a prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. Joseph's rise to power was not just a result of his skills or his knowledge, it was a testament to God's perfect timing. Joseph had been in prison for years, yet when the moment came, he was ready. God had prepared him through all of his trials, hardships, and delays. What seemed like a setback in his life was actually part of God's divine plan. The timing of Joseph's rise to power is a reminder that God's plans often unfold in ways we don't expect. We may go through seasons of waiting, difficulty, or even despair, but all of those experiences are part of God's perfect timing. When it's time for our breakthrough, nothing can stand in the way. Joseph's story teaches us the importance of trusting God's timing. It's easy to become impatient when we feel like we're stuck in a season of waiting, but we must remember that God is always working behind the scenes. Just like Joseph, we are being prepared for something greater. His timing is never early or late, it's always perfect. Think about the challenges you've faced in your own life. Maybe you've been waiting for a breakthrough, or maybe you've felt like things aren't moving fast enough. Joseph's story reminds us that God's timing is always worth the wait. When it's our time to step into the purpose He has for us, He will open doors that no one can close. Trust in His perfect timing because He is preparing you for something incredible. Joseph's rise to power was not just a personal victory, it was a victory for God's people, for Egypt, and for the world. Through Joseph, God saved countless lives during the famine, and just as God used Joseph in that moment of history, He can use you in your moment. When it's time for your breakthrough, trust that it will be the right time, God's time. When Joseph's brothers came to Egypt seeking food during the famine, they had no idea that they were about to encounter the brother they had betrayed years earlier. In their minds, Joseph was still the dreamer they had sold into slavery, far away and probably forgotten. But Joseph was no longer the boy they once knew. He was now the powerful second-in-command of Egypt, overseeing the grain distribution and the very man they needed to save their lives. At first, Joseph recognized his brothers immediately, but they didn't recognize him. He saw them standing before him, desperate, unaware that they were about to face the consequences of their past actions. Joseph could have easily turned them away, or worse, punished them for what they had done to him. But instead he took a different approach. Joseph didn't act out of vengeance, but out of a desire to heal the deep wounds of betrayal. Rather than showing his brothers his anger or resentment, he decided to test their hearts. He wanted to see if they had changed since the days when they sold him into slavery. So Joseph created a series of tests. He accused them of being spies and demanded that they bring their youngest brother Benjamin to Egypt as proof of their honesty. As Joseph watched them interact, he noticed something remarkable. The brothers had changed. They were no longer the same jealous and cruel men they had been before. In fact, they showed signs of remorse and a willingness to protect each other. Reuben, the oldest brother, even offered to sacrifice his own life to protect Benjamin, showing the depth of his transformation. This moment was pivotal. Joseph realized that his brothers had genuinely repented and that they were no longer the men who had callously betrayed him. He could see that they were now willing to do whatever it took to keep their family together and to make amends for their past mistakes. The moment of reconciliation came when Joseph could no longer hold back his emotions. He revealed his true identity to his brothers. Imagine the shock and disbelief that must have filled their hearts when they realized that the brother they had wronged was now standing before them in a position of power and authority. But instead of condemning them, Joseph embraced them with open arms. Joseph's words were full of grace. "Don't be afraid. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50:20. This statement was a powerful reminder of the sovereignty of God in our lives. Joseph understood that, despite the pain of his past, God had used his suffering to accomplish something greater than he could have imagined. His forgiveness was not just for his brothers, it was also a declaration of God's redemptive power. Forgiveness is one of the most powerful forces in the world. It has the ability to heal deep wounds, restore broken relationships, and bring freedom to both the one who forgives and the one who is forgiven. Joseph's story shows us that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the past, but rather choosing to let go of the desire for revenge and trusting that God can bring good from our pain. When Joseph forgave his brothers, he demonstrated that true forgiveness doesn't depend on the other person's actions. It depends on our ability to let go of our own hurt and to trust that God is in control. His forgiveness allowed his family to be reconciled and ultimately saved them from the famine. It also allowed Joseph to experience peace and healing in his own heart. So what does forgiveness look like in your life? Are there people you need to forgive or areas where you need to release your pain to God? Joseph's example teaches us that forgiveness is not easy. It's a process that requires faith, humility, and a willingness to trust God with our hurt. But when we choose to forgive, we open the door for God to work in our lives in ways we never imagined. Joseph's story reminds us that forgiveness is not just for the person who wronged us, it's for our own healing. When we forgive, we allow God to restore what has been broken and to bring beauty from our ashes. Just as Joseph's forgiveness restored his family, our forgiveness can restore our hearts and relationships. Joseph's rise from being a prisoner to a prince in Egypt is one of the most incredible stories of divine elevation in the Bible. He was once a young man, stripped of his dignity and thrown into a pit by his own brothers, betrayed and sold into slavery. But despite the immense suffering, Joseph's journey reveals something extraordinary: the power of God's plan, even when we can't see it. After being sold into slavery in Egypt, Joseph found himself working in the house of Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh. He was a servant, far from his family, with no clear path ahead. However, Joseph's character shone through even in these humble and painful circumstances. The Bible tells us that the Lord was with Joseph, Genesis 39:2, and that made all the difference. Despite being in a foreign land, Joseph remained faithful, trusted God, and worked diligently, gaining Potiphar's trust. Joseph's faithfulness was not in vain. He was soon put in charge of Potiphar's entire household. But as we know, Joseph's life was not destined to be one of ease and comfort. One day, Potiphar's wife, who had taken a liking to Joseph, tried to seduce him. Joseph, knowing it was wrong and would dishonor God, refused her advances, saying, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Genesis 39:9. His commitment to doing the right thing cost him dearly. Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of attempting to assault her, and Joseph was thrown into prison. From the height of success, Joseph fell to the depths of despair. But here's where God's plan shines through. Even in prison, Joseph didn't give up. He continued to serve faithfully and gained the trust of the prison warden. Joseph's trust in God, even when he was betrayed and imprisoned, kept him in a posture of service and integrity. He didn't allow his circumstances to dictate his character. Through his obedience and faithfulness, Joseph eventually gained favor even in the prison, demonstrating that God could bless him no matter where he was. One day, two of Pharaoh's officials, his chief cupbearer and chief baker, were thrown into prison. They had both offended Pharaoh and were awaiting their judgment. During their time in prison, they had disturbing dreams that troubled them, and Joseph, who had gained a reputation for interpreting dreams, offered to help. He interpreted the dreams with God's wisdom, and his predictions came true. The cupbearer was restored to his position, while the baker was executed. Before the cupbearer left prison, Joseph asked him to remember him and speak to Pharaoh on his behalf, but the cupbearer forgot about him. Joseph was left waiting for 2 more years, yet his faith never wavered. This waiting period was incredibly painful, but it was also part of God's perfect timing. At just the right moment, Pharaoh had a dream that none of his magicians or wise men could interpret. The cupbearer remembered Joseph, and he was brought before Pharaoh. Joseph's trust in God and his ability to interpret dreams came to the forefront once again. He boldly declared that he could interpret Pharaoh's dream, but only because God would give him the answer. Pharaoh's dream revealed that there would be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph's wisdom and understanding of God's plan led him to suggest a strategy to prepare for the coming famine, storing up grain during the 7 years of abundance. Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph's wisdom and the hand of God upon him that he promoted Joseph to second in command. Over all of Egypt, he gave Joseph authority over the entire land and entrusted him with the task of managing the grain storage. Joseph was now the ruler of Egypt, overseeing the most important plan for the survival of the people during the coming famine. Joseph's rise from prisoner to prince is a testament to God's faithfulness and timing. God's hand was upon Joseph from the very beginning, and even when it seemed like everything was falling apart, God was orchestrating the events for Joseph's eventual promotion. Joseph's story teaches us that no matter what our circumstances may be, God can use us and bless us if we remain faithful and trust in His plan. Joseph didn't allow bitterness or anger to rule his heart after being falsely accused, imprisoned, and forgotten. Instead, he chose to remain faithful, knowing that God had a greater purpose for his life. And when the time came, God elevated him to a position of influence and power. His story reminds us that the setbacks and trials we face are often part of God's greater plan, and He will elevate us in His perfect timing. Joseph's faithfulness, patience, and trust in God were key to his rise to power, and his story encourages us to trust that God's plan is always worth the wait. Joseph's story takes an even deeper turn when he is finally reunited with his brothers after many years of separation. Remember, these are the same brothers who betrayed him, threw him into a pit, and sold him into slavery. Imagine the emotions Joseph must have felt upon seeing them again. The anger, the pain, the deep sense of injustice. It's hard to even comprehend the mental and emotional turmoil he could have gone through. But Joseph's response to them is nothing short of extraordinary. When his brothers arrived in Egypt, seeking food during the famine, they didn't recognize Joseph. He was now the second most powerful man in Egypt, dressed in royal attire and speaking their language. Yet Joseph recognized them immediately. At that moment, Joseph could have taken revenge. He could have had them arrested, imprisoned, or even executed. After all, they had ruined his life, sold him into slavery, and caused him years of suffering. But instead of seeking revenge, Joseph did something far more profound. Joseph chose to forgive them. He chose to release them from the burden of their wrongdoings, and that was not an easy choice. Forgiveness, as we know, is not something that comes naturally, especially when we have been deeply hurt. But Joseph, despite all the pain and loss he experienced, demonstrated the power of God's love and grace by choosing to forgive. At first, Joseph didn't reveal himself to his brothers. He tested them to see if they had changed. He wanted to know if they were truly sorry for what they had done. He wanted to see if they had repented, if they had grown from the person they were when they betrayed him. Joseph's tests were not about getting revenge. They were about reconciliation. He wanted to see if they had become better men, if they had become the kind of men who could be trusted with a second chance. He tested their character, their integrity, and their hearts. Through his tests, Joseph saw that they had indeed changed. They were remorseful for their past actions. They were willing to do whatever it took to protect their youngest brother, Benjamin, from harm, even if it meant giving up their own freedom. Finally, Joseph could no longer hold back. His heart was moved with compassion, and he revealed himself to his brothers. He said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Genesis 45:4-5. These words must have shocked them. They were expecting anger, judgment, and punishment, but instead they received mercy, grace, and the greatest gift of all, forgiveness. Joseph's forgiveness wasn't just a mere act of letting go of past hurts. It was an act of grace. He understood that God had been working in his life through all the pain and suffering. Joseph realized that his hardships had a greater purpose. He saw how God had used every difficult moment in his life to prepare him for this very moment. So, that he could save not only Egypt, but also his family from destruction. Joseph had learned to trust in God's plan, even when it didn't make sense. He had learned that God was in control, and he allowed that truth to shape his response to those who had wronged him. The power of Joseph's forgiveness is not just in the fact that he forgave, but in the way he forgave. He didn't hold grudges. He didn't remind his brothers of their wrongs. Instead, he reassured them that they were forgiven, and he spoke words of comfort and hope. He told them that what they had intended for evil, God had used for good. Joseph had a deep understanding of God's sovereignty and how everything, even the most painful experiences, could be used for a greater purpose. Joseph's forgiveness also opened the door to restoration. He didn't just forgive them in words, he extended grace through action. He invited them to live in Egypt, where they would have food and a place to stay during the remaining years of the famine. Joseph provided for them, cared for them, and welcomed them back into his life with open arms. He didn't hold their past mistakes over their heads. Instead, he chose to build a future with them. This act of forgiveness is a powerful reminder for us all. When we choose to forgive those who have hurt us, we are not only setting them free, but we are also setting ourselves free. Holding on to unforgiveness keeps us bound in bitterness, anger, and resentment, but forgiveness opens the door to healing, restoration, and peace. Joseph's story shows us that forgiveness is not about forgetting what happened, but about releasing the power that those wrongs have over us. It's about letting go of the chains that bind our hearts and allowing God to heal our wounds. Joseph's forgiveness teaches us that no matter how deep the hurt or how great the offense, we are called to forgive. And when we choose to forgive, we are following in the footsteps of Christ, who forgave us even when we didn't deserve it. Just as God extended grace and mercy to us, we are called to extend that same grace and mercy to others. Forgiveness may not be easy, but it is always worth it. And in the end, it is through forgiveness that we experience true freedom and peace. As we continue through Joseph's story, it becomes clear that the promise of reconciliation and restoration that God had whispered into Joseph's heart was about to come to pass. The road had been long and painful, but God's plan was beginning to unfold in a powerful way. The moment Joseph had been waiting for, when he could be reunited with his family, was drawing near. This was the moment when all his suffering, all the years of injustice, would culminate in the fulfillment of God's purpose. We've seen Joseph rise from the depths of betrayal and suffering. From the pit to the palace, Joseph's journey had been full of hardship, but it was also a testament to his unwavering faith in God. And now, as the famine spread across the land, the time had come for Joseph to fulfill the promise he had made to his father Jacob. The moment had arrived for Joseph to bring his family to Egypt, to protect them from the famine, and to offer them a future of security and provision. But the journey was not just about physical survival. It was also about restoring the bond that had been broken so many years ago. Joseph's family, unaware of the great man that Joseph had become, traveled to Egypt to buy grain. At this point, Joseph had already been testing their hearts, seeing if they had truly changed from the men they had been when they sold him into slavery. His brothers, still unaware of Joseph's identity, stood before him as a humbled, repentant group. They no longer acted as they had when they had thrown him into that pit all those years ago. They were different now, shaped by their own experiences, by the loss of their father's love, by the fear of losing their youngest brother, Benjamin. They had come to recognize the consequences of their actions, and they were ready to make amends. But Joseph's heart wasn't just focused on their repentance, it was also focused on the promise of restoration. Joseph knew that it wasn't enough for him just to forgive them. God had a greater plan in mind. Joseph's story wasn't about mere reconciliation. It was about healing the deep wounds that had been inflicted on his family. The story was about restoring what had been broken, about bringing his family back together in a way that only God could orchestrate. When Joseph finally revealed himself to his brothers, his words were not filled with bitterness or revenge, but with overwhelming emotion. He cried out, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." Genesis 45:4. Imagine the shock and disbelief on the faces of his brothers. They had no idea that the powerful man before them the man who had given them food and a place to stay, was the same man they had betrayed all those years ago. And yet, instead of demanding justice, Joseph chose mercy. Instead of casting blame, Joseph chose to restore the broken relationship. He understood that God's plan for his life wasn't about punishing his brothers, it was about healing his family, about bringing his father Jacob and the entire family back together in love. Joseph's decision to forgive and restore his family shows us the depth of God's grace and mercy. It demonstrates that no matter how deep the hurt or how great the betrayal, God has the power to heal and restore. The moment Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, the floodgates of reconciliation opened. Joseph's heart overflowed with compassion and love for his family. He immediately reassured them that they had nothing to fear. "Do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here," he told them. "It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Genesis 45:5. These words were not just an expression of forgiveness, they were an acknowledgement that God had been at work all along. Joseph recognized that every step of his journey, every trial and hardship, had led him to this moment, to this divine fulfillment of God's plan. Joseph's heart for reconciliation didn't stop with just his brothers. He wanted to ensure that his father Jacob was brought into the fold as well. Joseph knew that the restoration of his family wouldn't be complete without bringing his father into the picture. And so he sent word to Jacob, urging him to come to Egypt and be reunited with his son. Joseph's actions in bringing his family to Egypt were a powerful symbol of God's provision, grace, and the fulfillment of promises. He didn't just provide for their immediate physical needs, but he also offered them a future together. When Jacob finally arrived in Egypt and saw his son Joseph alive, it was a moment of pure joy and fulfillment. The family was finally whole again, and Joseph's faithfulness had been rewarded. This reunion was the culmination of everything Joseph had gone through. It was the moment when God's purpose in his life became fully realized. Through all the years of suffering, Joseph had never lost sight of the bigger picture. He had never stopped trusting that God was working, even when the circumstances seemed impossible. And now, as he stood with his family, Joseph could see the beauty of God's plan unfold before him. Joseph's story teaches us that God's timing is perfect. Even when it seems like things are falling apart, God is at work behind the scenes, orchestrating every detail of our lives. Joseph's restoration of his family didn't happen overnight. It took time, patience, and a deep trust in God's faithfulness. But when the moment came, it was more beautiful and powerful than he could have ever imagined. The promise of family restoration is a promise that God continues to offer us today. Whether we've been hurt by loved ones, separated by distance, or broken by betrayal, God has the power to restore what has been lost. Through His grace, we can experience the healing of our relationships and the fulfillment of His promises. Just as Joseph's family was reunited in love, so too can our relationships be restored, and our lives be filled with the peace and joy that come from God's perfect plan. In the end, Joseph's family was not only reunited, but they were also blessed with abundance. They were given land to settle in, a place to call home. They were provided for and they lived in peace. Joseph's story reminds us that when we trust in God's plan and remain faithful, He will not only restore us, but also bless us beyond what we can imagine. Joseph's journey wasn't just about survival, it was about the fulfillment of God's promises, the restoration of his family, and the blessing of a future together in God's perfect timing. And that is a promise we can hold on to today. As we reach the final chapter of Joseph's remarkable story, we are reminded that even the greatest of journeys come to an end. Joseph, the once young dreamer who had been betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, had now risen to become one of the most powerful men in Egypt. But despite his position of power, Joseph never lost sight of the God who had been with him every step of the way. As he lay on his deathbed, his heart was filled with peace, knowing that his life had been lived with purpose and that his faith had never wavered. Joseph's death wasn't just the end of a great story, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. For his family, his legacy was not one of wealth or status, but one of faith, forgiveness, and a deep trust in God's plan. His final words to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," Genesis 50:24, were filled with hope and assurance. These words were not just a reminder of God's promises, but also a call to his family to remain faithful, just as he had. Joseph's legacy was one of forgiveness. After everything he had been through, the betrayal, the years of hardship, the false accusations, and the pain of separation, Joseph had chosen forgiveness. He had chosen to let go of the past and embrace God's healing. He had forgiven his brothers for their betrayal and had shown them the love and mercy that only God can provide. And now, on his deathbed, Joseph's message to his family was clear. Hold on to God's promises, forgive as I have forgiven you, and trust that his plan will continue to unfold. The depth of Joseph's forgiveness is perhaps most evident in the way he treated his brothers after they had wronged him. Joseph could have easily taken revenge on them, given his power and authority. He could have held a grudge, made them suffer, or demanded that they pay for their actions. But instead, he chose to forgive. He chose to heal the wounds that had been inflicted on his family and to bring about reconciliation. He chose mercy over justice, compassion over condemnation. Joseph's ability to forgive his brothers was a direct reflection of the grace and mercy that God had shown him. It was God who had been with Joseph in the pit, God who had been with him in Potiphar's house, and God who had been with him in the prison. It was God who had lifted him up and placed him in a position of authority, and it was God who had given Joseph the strength to forgive. Joseph understood that forgiveness was not just an act of mercy, it was a reflection of the love that God had poured out on him. But Joseph's message didn't stop at forgiveness. He also reminded his family of God's promises. Throughout his life, Joseph had trusted in God's plan, even when the path seemed unclear. He had trusted that God would provide, that God would deliver, and that God would be faithful to his word. And as he prepared to leave this world, Joseph wanted to make sure that his family would continue to trust in God's promises long after he was gone. He wanted them to remember that God had promised them a future in the land of Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey, a promise that would be fulfilled in generations to come. In the midst of his own personal trials, Joseph had never wavered in his belief that God's promises were true. And now, even in his final moments, he was urging his family to hold on to that faith, to trust that God would lead them into the future he had prepared for them. Joseph's death was not the end of God's plan for his family. It was simply a transition, a stepping stone toward the greater fulfillment of God's purpose. Joseph's final days were filled with a sense of peace and hope. He knew that God's plan was bigger than anything he could have imagined. He knew that even though he would not live to see the full fruition of God's promises, his legacy would continue to inspire his family and generations to come. He had been a faithful servant, and now it was time for God to continue his work through his descendants. Joseph's legacy is a legacy of faith. It is a reminder that no matter the circumstances, we can trust in God's plan. Even when we face hardships, betrayal, and loss, God is with us. Even when things don't go as we expect, God's plan is still unfolding, and his promises remain true. Joseph's life shows us that faith is not about understanding everything. It's about trusting God through the unknowns, believing that he is working behind the scenes for our good. As Joseph's family buried him in Egypt, they were reminded of the promises he had made to them, the promises of forgiveness, restoration, and faith. His death marked the end of one chapter, but it also marked the beginning of another. Joseph's family would continue on, guided by the hope and trust that their God would be faithful to fulfill his promises. And through it all, Joseph's story would live on as a testimony to the power of faith, forgiveness, and the unshakable trust that God's plan will always come to fruition, no matter what. In conclusion, Joseph's death wasn't the end. It was the fulfillment of a life well lived in faith. His legacy was one of trust in God, of forgiveness, and of a deep commitment to God's promises. Through his life, Joseph had shown us that no matter how difficult the journey, God is faithful to his word. Joseph's story continues to remind us that even in the face of adversity, we are called to forgive, to trust, and to live with the hope that God's promises will come to pass. As we reflect on Joseph's incredible journey, we must recognize that it's not just his individual story that has significance. Joseph's life is a part of a much larger narrative, a grand story of redemption that spans the entire Bible. His life was not an isolated event, but a link in the chain of God's sovereign plan, a plan that would eventually lead to the salvation of the entire world. From the moment that Joseph's dreams were first shared with his brothers, it was clear that God had a purpose for his life, a purpose that would be fulfilled not only through Joseph's individual success, but through the challenges and adversities he faced. From being sold into slavery to rising to the second highest position in Egypt, Joseph's path was difficult, yet it was always moving forward in alignment with God's purpose. And even in his darkest moments, Joseph trusted that God was working behind the scenes, orchestrating every event for a greater good. When Joseph was sold by his brothers, he couldn't have known that this was part of God's greater plan. He couldn't have known that the years he spent in Potiphar's house, then in prison, would prepare him for a time such as this. But he chose to remain faithful, to trust God, and to continue serving in whatever position he found himself. And when the time came, God elevated him to a position where he could save not only Egypt, but also his own family, the very family that had betrayed him. This brings us to an essential point in Joseph's story. God's plan of redemption was unfolding. Joseph's life was a catalyst for something much bigger than himself. Through his position of power, Joseph was able to help the people of Egypt survive a terrible famine. But even more profoundly, Joseph's ability to forgive his brothers paved the way for reconciliation and restoration within his family. In a way, the redemption of his brothers mirrored the redemption that God offers all of humanity. It was a foreshadowing of God's larger plan of salvation for the world. Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers is significant because it demonstrates the heart of God. God's plan for humanity was always centered around forgiveness, mercy, and grace. Even when we fail, even when we sin, God is always ready to forgive, to restore, and to redeem. Joseph's actions are a mirror of God's grace in our own lives. Just as Joseph forgave his brothers, so too has God forgiven us through the sacrifice of his Son, Jesus Christ. The promise of redemption is not just a future hope, it is an ongoing reality. Joseph's life points us toward the ultimate redemption that is offered through Christ. Just as Joseph saved his family from physical death during the famine, so too does Christ offer us salvation from spiritual death. The story of Joseph is a shadow of the ultimate redemption story, the story of Jesus Christ, who came to save us from sin and death. As Joseph lay on his deathbed, his final words to his brothers spoke of a future hope, a promise that God would bring them back to the land he had promised to their ancestors. These words echoed the promises that God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph's death was not the end of God's plan. It was just another step in the fulfillment of the covenant God had made with his people. Joseph knew that God's plan was far-reaching, and that even though he would not see it fully realized in his lifetime, God would remain faithful to his word. Joseph's life is a reminder to us that God's timing is not our timing. We often want to see results immediately, but God's plans unfold over time, sometimes in ways that we don't fully understand. Joseph had no idea that his suffering would eventually lead to the salvation of his family and the preservation of God's covenant, but he remained faithful, and God's plan unfolded perfectly. This teaches us that we are often part of a much larger plan that God is working out in the world. We may not see the immediate results of our actions, but we can trust that God is using our lives to accomplish his purposes. One of the key lessons from Joseph's life is that redemption is never earned. It is a gift. Joseph didn't earn his position in Egypt. He didn't deserve to be elevated from the pit to the palace. But God, in his mercy and grace, placed him in that position. Similarly, we don't earn our salvation. It is a gift from God, given to us because of his great love for us. Just as Joseph didn't take revenge on his brothers, but instead offered forgiveness, so too does God extend forgiveness to us, even though we are undeserving. The promise of redemption is not just a promise for the future, it is a promise for today. It is the promise that no matter what we go through, God is working in our lives. Even in the darkest moments, God is using our experiences to shape us, mold us, and prepare us for something greater. Just as Joseph's suffering led to the redemption of his family, so too can our trials lead to God's greater purposes being fulfilled in our lives. As we reflect on the story of Joseph, we are reminded that God's plan of redemption is bigger than our own understanding. His plan stretches across generations, weaving through the lives of countless individuals. And just as Joseph played a pivotal role in God's plan, so too are we invited to be a part of his redemptive work in the world. God has a plan for each of us, and no matter where we are in our journey, we can trust that he is working in us, just as he worked in Joseph's life, to bring about his kingdom. In conclusion, the promise of redemption is a theme that runs throughout the Bible, and Joseph's life is a powerful illustration of this truth. Through Joseph's story, we see that no matter the trials we face, God is always at work behind the scenes, using our circumstances to accomplish his greater plan. And just as Joseph's faithfulness led to the redemption of his family, so too does God invite us to be a part of his redemptive story in the world today. Through forgiveness, faith, and trust in God's perfect timing, we can be part of his eternal plan. One of the most powerful aspects of Joseph's story is his unwavering integrity, especially when faced with intense temptation. Joseph's life wasn't without challenges or struggles. In fact, some of the most difficult moments he faced involved making decisions that required him to stay true to his values, even when no one was looking. One such moment stands out: the day Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. Imagine for a moment the scene. Joseph, a young man in his prime, alone in a position of power in the household of one of Egypt's most powerful men. Potiphar's wife, with her intentions clear, attempted to lure Joseph into a sinful relationship. This was a moment that could have easily led Joseph down a path of compromise. After all, who would have known? He was far from home, surrounded by wealth and influence, and his chances of getting caught seemed slim. In that moment, it would have been tempting for Joseph to justify his actions, to take advantage of the situation, to ignore his conscience, and go along with what was being offered. But Joseph didn't succumb to the pressure. He resisted. With great strength of character, he said no. "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" he asked, as recorded in Genesis 39:9. This was a profound declaration of his commitment to God's righteousness, even in the face of temptation. For Joseph, the decision wasn't just about his own moral code, it was about his relationship with God. He understood that sin was not just a violation of human rules, it was an offense against the very heart of God. Joseph's response shows us something vital. Integrity is not just about doing the right thing when people are watching. It's about doing the right thing when no one is around to see. It's about choosing righteousness, even when it would be easier to give in to temptation. Joseph's decision was made in secret, and yet it was a decision that defined the course of his life. He chose to honor God over his own desires, and that decision led to blessings beyond what he could have imagined. This moment in Joseph's life teaches us that integrity is often tested in the quiet moments when the stakes may seem lower. We live in a world that often tells us it's okay to bend the rules, to compromise, to take shortcuts to success. Whether it's cheating in school, lying to get ahead at work, or giving in to personal temptations, the pressure to act outside of our values is everywhere. Yet Joseph's story reminds us that true success comes not from our circumstances, but from our character. When Joseph chose to flee from Potiphar's wife, he wasn't just avoiding a momentary temptation. He was safeguarding his relationship with God and protecting his integrity. His choice to run may have seemed like a small act, but it was a pivotal one. Joseph showed us that sometimes the best way to resist temptation is to flee from it, to remove ourselves from the situation, and to rely on God's strength in our weakness. This decision wasn't easy. In fact, it led to his false accusation and imprisonment. But Joseph's actions set him apart as a man who valued God's righteousness above the temporary pleasures of sin. Joseph's story challenges us to consider how we respond when faced with temptation. Do we, like Joseph, choose righteousness even when it seems difficult or costly? Do we flee from temptation, or do we entertain it? Are we willing to suffer for doing the right thing, knowing that our obedience to God's standards will ultimately lead to His favor and blessing? In the world we live in today, where moral lines are often blurred, it's easy to lose sight of the importance of integrity. But Joseph's life reminds us that integrity is not an optional virtue. It's essential for those who desire to live in a way that honors God. Just as Joseph's refusal to compromise his values ultimately led to his rise in Egypt, our commitment to righteousness can lead us to the plans and purposes God has for our lives. Joseph's refusal to give in to temptation also highlights another vital lesson. God sees our faithfulness, even when others don't. Joseph could have easily justified his actions. He could have reasoned that no one would know, that it wasn't a big deal, and that he deserved a little pleasure after all he'd been through. But Joseph's faithfulness wasn't contingent on human approval. His eyes were on God, and he trusted that God would reward his integrity. And in the end, God did. This story serves as a reminder that we may not always see the immediate rewards for our choices, especially when they involve standing firm in our faith or resisting temptation. But God sees and honors our choices, and in His perfect timing, He brings about the results of our faithfulness. Even when we face trials, struggles, or injustice for doing the right thing, we can trust that God is working behind the scenes, using our faithfulness to bring about His plan for our lives. Joseph's story also gives us hope. No matter how far we may have fallen, or how many times we've failed in the face of temptation, God offers us grace and forgiveness. He is ready to help us rebuild our integrity and align our lives with His will. Just as Joseph was able to rise above his circumstances, we too can overcome our struggles through God's strength. In conclusion, Joseph's life teaches us that integrity is worth fighting for, even when the cost is high. His decision to choose righteousness over temptation set him apart as a man of character and faith. Let us learn from his example and strive to be people of integrity, people who choose to honor God in every area of our lives. When we choose integrity, we choose a path of blessing, a path that leads to God's perfect plan for our lives. The story of Joseph is not only about the strength to endure, but also about the power of forgiveness. This is a story that teaches us how deep wounds can be healed through the act of forgiving. Imagine, for a moment, the intense emotions Joseph must have experienced when he first encountered his brothers after they had betrayed him years earlier. These brothers, who had once thrown him into a pit, sold him as a slave, and left him to suffer, were now standing before him in need of his help. Joseph had every right to be angry, every right to seek revenge. After all, they had caused him so much pain. They had taken everything from him, his family, his freedom, and his dignity. His life had been shattered by their betrayal. They had abandoned him in his moment of greatest need, and now they were standing in front of him, unaware of his true identity. But Joseph's response was not one of anger, hatred, or revenge. Instead, it was one of forgiveness. In Genesis 45:4-8, when Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, he speaks these powerful words, "And now, do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Notice the words Joseph uses. It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Joseph recognized that while his brothers had meant harm, God had used their actions for a greater purpose. This perspective of seeing God's hand in the midst of his suffering allowed Joseph to forgive. He understood that forgiveness was not about excusing their actions, but about releasing the pain and bitterness that could have held him captive for the rest of his life. Joseph's forgiveness was not immediate or easy. His journey to this moment of reconciliation was long and filled with emotional turmoil. It took years of processing the pain, the injustice, and the hurt. But through that time, Joseph chose to trust that God was in control and that he would use his situation for something greater. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. It's not about pretending the wrong didn't happen or minimizing the pain. It's about choosing to release the hold that anger, bitterness, and resentment have over us. Forgiveness sets us free, not the one who wronged us, but ourselves. Joseph chose freedom. He chose peace. And in doing so, he set an example for us all. Think about how Joseph could have reacted differently. He could have decided to make his brothers suffer in return, to punish them for what they had done. After all, they were at his mercy. But Joseph's heart was different. His decision to forgive was an act of obedience to God and a demonstration of his deep trust in God's plan. He saw the bigger picture. Though his brothers had wronged him, God had used those wrongs to position him exactly where he needed to be to fulfill his purpose and to save countless lives. Joseph's forgiveness also teaches us about the importance of reconciliation. When Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, he didn't just forgive them in private or in his heart. He actively pursued reconciliation. He didn't want the brokenness of the past to linger, nor did he want the wounds to go unhealed. He invited his brothers into his life, telling them to bring their father and their families to live with him in Egypt, and he provided for them during the years of famine. Forgiveness is not just about letting go of anger, it's about rebuilding relationships and making things right where possible. Joseph's ability to forgive was rooted in his faith. He had seen God's faithfulness in his life over and over again. From being sold into slavery to rising to power in Egypt, Joseph had come to understand that God's ways are higher than our ways, and his purposes are greater than our understanding. This understanding of God's sovereignty made forgiveness possible. Joseph knew that God was in control, and that even his suffering had a purpose. Because of this, he could let go of the anger and pain his brothers had caused him and trust God to make things right in his time. Forgiveness, as Joseph's story illustrates, is an act of strength, not weakness. It takes strength to forgive, especially when we have been deeply wounded. Forgiving does not mean we forget the offense or that we let the person off the hook. It means we trust God to deal with the wrongs done to us, and we choose to move forward without being held captive by bitterness. As followers of Christ, we are called to forgive as we have been forgiven. Joseph's story is a powerful reminder of this command. Jesus, in his teachings, often emphasized the importance of forgiveness, saying in Matthew 18:21-22 that we should forgive not just 7 times but 77 times. Why? Because forgiveness reflects the heart of God. It's a reflection of his grace toward us, even when we don't deserve it. Joseph's act of forgiveness demonstrates that when we choose to forgive, we are participating in God's redemptive plan. In forgiving his brothers, Joseph allowed God to work through him to bring healing not only to himself, but to his entire family. And just as Joseph was able to forgive the very ones who had wronged him, we too are called to forgive those who have hurt us. When we do, we open ourselves to the possibility of healing, restoration, and a deeper relationship with God. Joseph's story challenges us to examine our own hearts. Are there people in our lives whom we need to forgive? Have we allowed bitterness or resentment to take root, preventing us from experiencing the peace that forgiveness brings? Joseph's forgiveness was not just about restoring his relationship with his brothers. It was about restoring his own soul. Forgiveness is a gift we give not only to others but to ourselves. In conclusion, the power of forgiveness in Joseph's life teaches us that forgiveness is a choice that leads to healing and reconciliation. It is not always easy, but it is always necessary. Through Joseph's example, we learn that true freedom comes when we release our hurts to God and trust Him to work in our lives. Just as Joseph forgave his brothers and allowed God to use their wrongs for good, we too can choose forgiveness and experience the peace that comes from trusting God with our pain. When we reflect on Joseph's story, one of the most profound lessons we can learn is how God's faithfulness is evident through every twist and turn of his life. From the pit to the palace, from betrayal to redemption, Joseph's journey was a powerful testament to God's unwavering commitment to his promises. Joseph's life wasn't just about his personal triumphs or struggles. It was about God's ultimate plan to bring about healing, restoration, and salvation. Joseph's story begins with a dream, a vision of greatness that God placed in his heart at a young age. But instead of the immediate fulfillment of that dream, Joseph's path was filled with challenges and hardships. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused and thrown into prison. These events could have easily led Joseph to question God's faithfulness. After all, it seemed as though the very opposite of what God had promised him was happening. But Joseph didn't lose sight of God's presence or his promises. Instead, he continued to trust God, even when circumstances seemed bleak. What is incredibly significant about Joseph's story is how even in the darkest moments God's faithfulness was evident. When Joseph was in Potiphar's house, it says in Genesis 39:2, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered." Even as a slave, far from home, Joseph was not alone. God was with him, providing for him and guiding him every step of the way. Joseph's ability to rise above his circumstances and remain faithful to God speaks to the depth of his trust in God's provision. He believed that God had a purpose for his life, even in the midst of trials. Similarly, when Joseph was thrown into prison after being falsely accused, he didn't allow bitterness or despair to take root. The Bible tells us in Genesis 39:21, "But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden." Even in prison, Joseph experienced God's faithfulness. He wasn't abandoned. Instead, God was using this time to refine Joseph, preparing him for the future he had in mind. Joseph's journey highlights an essential truth. God's faithfulness is not always demonstrated in the way we expect. Sometimes his faithfulness looks like a difficult road, a road that doesn't make sense in the moment. But through every hardship, God was preparing Joseph for something greater. He was molding his character, teaching him patience, humility, and the ability to forgive. Each setback in Joseph's life wasn't a sign of God's absence. It was an opportunity for God to work his purpose in and through Joseph. And then, of course, came the moment when Joseph's dreams were finally realized. When he stood before Pharaoh and interpreted his dream, it was clear that God had orchestrated every event in Joseph's life for this very moment. In Genesis 41:39-41, Pharaoh says, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders." Joseph's rise to power wasn't just a personal victory, it was God's victory. It was the fulfillment of his promise to Joseph, and it was a testament to God's faithfulness to keep his word, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart. What makes Joseph's story so inspiring is that he never lost sight of the bigger picture. He understood that his life wasn't just about his own dreams, but about God's greater plan. When Joseph was reunited with his brothers, he didn't hold on to anger or resentment. Instead, he acknowledged how God had worked through all of the painful circumstances in his life. In Genesis 45:7, Joseph tells his brothers, "But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Joseph recognized that God's faithfulness wasn't just about his personal success. It was about God's plan of redemption for his family and ultimately for the world. Through Joseph, God provided for his family during a time of famine, but he also set the stage for the future of Israel. The nation of Israel, which would one day give birth to the Messiah, was preserved through Joseph's obedience and trust in God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness, as seen in Joseph's life, invites us to see the bigger picture in our own lives. It can be easy to focus on the hardships we face and to feel as though God has abandoned us. But the story of Joseph reminds us that God is always working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. Just as he used Joseph's suffering to bring about salvation, he is using our struggles to shape us and to prepare us for something greater. The faithfulness of God in Joseph's life is also a reminder that God's timing is perfect. Joseph didn't rise to power overnight. It took years of waiting, of trusting, and of enduring hardship. But in God's perfect timing, everything fell into place. Joseph's dream was fulfilled when he least expected it, and when it happened, it was more magnificent than he could have ever imagined. God's timing is often different from our own, but it is always perfect. In the end, Joseph's story teaches us that God is faithful to his promises, even when the road is long and difficult. We may not always understand why we go through certain trials, but we can be assured that God is with us every step of the way, and that He has a plan for our lives. Just as He was faithful to Joseph, He will be faithful to us. And like Joseph, we can trust that no matter how dark the valley may seem, God's light will shine through, guiding us toward the fulfillment of His promises. So, as you reflect on Joseph's life, take a moment to consider your own journey. Are you facing trials and challenges that seem insurmountable? Are you struggling to see God's faithfulness in your own life? Remember that God is always at work, even when we can't see it. Trust in His faithfulness and know that just like Joseph, you too are part of a bigger picture that God is orchestrating. His plan is always good, and His promises will always come to pass. Keep trusting, keep persevering, and know that God is with you, just as He was with Joseph every step of the way.